Long time no.
Oh,
Great.
new baby.
Oh, thank you. Boy, 3 months. Amazing. Good. Good evening. Welcome to Matter. Hi. I'm Stephen Collins. I'm the CEO of Matter. Thanks for being here. Thanks for coming this evening. We have a great panel discussion. I just wanted to kick it off. We announced, launched the 3.8 initiative last August. Does everyone know why it's called? I assume everyone knows why it's called 3.8. I don't have to. Does everybody? No? Okay, so today is International Women's Day, which is March 8th, which is 3-8, and so it's 3.8. I can't take credit for that. Thank you, Miriam. But so that's why it's called 3.8. And it was really created with the premise or with the fact pattern that 70% of startup companies don't have any women on their boards of directors. And in Chicago, when we look around the healthcare community, we have many, many, many very talented, experienced female executives in lots of healthcare companies across the Chicago region. And the premise was, could we help solve this problem by partly playing matchmaker, partly playing curator, partly doing events like this, where we really help guide people and help place women on boards and advisory boards of startup companies. The event was, or the program was really the brainchild of Holly Copeland. Does everybody know Holly? If you don't, you will shortly. So Holly Copeland, just to go backwards a little bit, worked for the state of Illinois and worked for the state of Illinois doing economic development at a time when some of us were trying to get state funding to open this place. And that ended up flowing through her office. So we've been very grateful to Holly for 4 years, since whenever we first got that. It was back at a time when the state was very actively involved in doing things like this and doing economic development. And we ended up getting $4 million from the state of Illinois to really build this facility and secure a lease. Holly then went on to work for Horizon Pharma. Horizon has been one of our key partners since the very beginning of creating and developing the idea of Matter. The CEO, Tim Walbert, serves as a co-chair of our board. Holly has been really active kind of point of contact and liaison for this. And so when she came to us and started working with Miriam Saleh, who was our VP of programs at the time, really with the idea for this program, it seemed like a perfect fit for us and something we were really excited to work on. So with that, I want to turn it over to Holly. She will then introduce the moderator, and we'll get into the panel, which is really probably why you're here, not to listen to me. So please welcome Holly Copeland.
It's a very kind introduction. Thank you, Steve. So I just wanted to share a little bit about Horizon before we jump into this very exciting panel celebration of International Women's Day and this exciting project that we launched about a year ago. Horizon Pharma is an international biopharmaceutical company. We have offices across the world. We're sort of the quintessential startup story. It started in Silicon Valley with our CEO joining the company as the first full-time paid employee. And he moved the company here because of the vibrant ecosystem that exists here. And oftentimes he'll say if a place like Matter had existed, he could have grown the company even faster than he had. So he's a strong supporter, as Steve mentioned. He's a founding co-chairman of the board. He currently serves in that capacity, and we're very active in supporting the ecosystem here. Now, within the umbrella of all of the activities that Horizon is engaged in the community, one of the things that we find most important is to support women in our communities, and how can we elevate them in ways that can really have a lasting, tangible impact. And so, as Steve alluded to, we came up with this idea about a year ago to create a program that would target women who are sort of mid-career. So not the women who are already in the C-suite and have a tremendous track record, but the women that are up-and-comers. How can we prepare them for future board service and thus address diversity issues that have tremendous impacts across a business? The bottom line, diversity of thought, and how that impacts the way businesses are built. And hence we came up with 3.8. So we're very excited to have all of you here tonight. We're going to hear from this excellent panel, kind of talk about their past experiences and their path and their journey, and lessons that we can all take from that back to our respective jobs and lives. And I would just say, keep an eye out. We've learned a lot over the last year, and we have a lot of exciting things coming up in the year to come. So thank you all for being here, and thank you. With that, I'll hand it over to our moderator, Alita, with Hyde Park Angels. She's actually been a great partner for us. From the very beginning of this conversation, we reached out to Hyde Park Angels to request their information, what they know about the community, what exists when it comes to promoting women on boards. And so we're very pleased that she's here tonight to help us lead this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Perfect. Thank you so much for coming out tonight, and happy International Women's Day. I'm really honored to be here with a panel of not only esteemed leaders, but really seasoned. Today we're really going to dig how to get onto a board, what best board practices are, and how to even think about whether you should be on a board, if that's something you want. But first, what I really want to do, thank you to our panelists, to Matter, to 3.8, because this initiative is so important. If you're thinking even just about startups and what's happening in that landscape, for the women and the men in this room, what you should know is that inclusion has actually been decreasing. Diversity has actually been decreasing on board. So in 2016, we saw 66% of startups with no women. And now we're up to 71%. The same trend is true across executive leaders. So if you look there, 57% of startups reported no female executives. And that is also really increased since 2015. But at the same time, what we're seeing is the number of inclusion programs are increasing. So they went up from 25% to 41% over the last year. And what's happening with the data from the National Venture Capital Association in conjunction with Deloitte and from SVB is showing is that these inclusion programs are just focused on retaining entry-level talent. They're not focused on getting women leadership positions, and they're certainly not focused on getting awards. So what 3.8 is doing is so important, and the fact that you are here is so important. I hope to see everyone here on a board, even the men that we have in the room too. I hope that we achieve positive outcomes for everybody. But I have a real passion for this project because I think it's how we're ultimately going to change. So before I hand things over to our panelists for introductions, I do want to get a sense of who we have in the room today. So raise your hand if you've never been on a board before. Okay. Raise your hand if you are on a board or have been on a board before. Okay, so we're about half and half. Raise your hand if you came here today to learn how to be on a board. And raise your hand if you're here because you want to learn how to be a better board member. Wow, okay, so we have a diverse crowd here. We'll focus on both of those areas based on who we have. So I want to do just 2 housekeeping items before we get started. We will be taking questions via social Q&A, so just a reminder, we won't be doing hand raising. Come to this iPad, and we'll look through those questions for the Q&A session. If we don't get to your questions, though, some of us will be hanging back to answer them, so we will be able to address them then. So I am going to hand it over for introductions. I'll start with my own. Just to get us kicked off, I can make all the mistakes so everybody else looks wonderful. So I'm Alita Miranda Wolf, and I am the Director of Platform at Hyde Park Angels. For those of you who don't know Hyde Park Angels, and even those of you who do, we are the most active early stage investor in the Midwest. We do more deals than any other firm in this region, period. And we've been able to do that for really 2 reasons. One, we only invest in the Midwest. We invest in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. That's it. We're the Midwest market experts. But 2, and this is really important, and speaks actually highly of Ellen, who is a founder of Hyde Park Angels and a member, and was a longtime board member of Hyde Park Angels, we take what we call a people-first approach to investing. And what that means is you cannot be an investor in Hyde Park Angels unless you have started, scaled, and sold your own company or headed up your own. And so what we are able to do is grow our companies through human capital as much through financial capital. And that's why we're seeing ultimately results and returns in the market. At Hyde Park Angels, I specifically manage our investors, partners, brand, and portfolio company growth. And when it comes to boards, one of my functions has been to really sit with our portfolio companies and think through governance strategies, board construction, especially at the earliest stages when it's happening for the first time, usually folks coming out of a convertible note who are just gonna put on management and an investor and figuring out who do I choose as an independent. That's how I'm really participating with them in that capacity. So I'll hand it over to Nancy.
Thanks. Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Nancy Sullivan. I lead Illinois Ventures. It's the venture capital arm associated with the University of Illinois. We've raised 3 private funds. We've got about 80 million in assets under management. And we play a unique role across the spectrum. So in some cases, we'll do very early seed stage investing if you're associated with the University of Illinois. That kind of requires it. That convertible note state, very early stage. Often they don't have a board, maybe the co-founder and ourselves trying to build a company with them. And then we move on to our private funds, which are later stage. Your true Series A. We'll invest about $1.5 million up to $2 million into an opportunity in that stage. And in that stage, we're either taking a voting board seat or a board observer role, depending on at what stage the company is. I'm really interested to see the background in this audience of people interested, 1, in getting boards, but 2, being a better board member. Because I feel like when you sit in a boardroom, the impact you're able to make and what you need to be able to do is defined by where the company is and what they need to be doing. And my definition and what we do at Illinois Ventures is typically pretty early stage. It is technology based, so we invest in 3 different sectors, often med tech, life sciences, physical sciences, and engineering, hardware, and software. And so often if it doesn't have a patent or something protectable behind it, it's not an ideal fit for us. I've been heading up the organization now for just about 4 years, but it's been around since 2002. And we have at this point over 25 companies in our portfolio. So I'm happy to be here tonight and look forward to sharing what we've learned along the way.
I'm Ellen Rudnick, and I am a senior advisor on entrepreneurship and a faculty member at Chicago Booth. I have been at Chicago Booth for almost 19 years. I started what is today the Polsky Center for Entrepreneurship. And prior to that, I spent 25 years in the healthcare industry, both with large corporations and then 10 years building businesses as an entrepreneur in the healthcare industry. So I'm very passionate about the healthcare industry, and in my work at the University of Chicago, I continue to work with companies that are in the healthcare industry and are spun out of the University of Chicago. I sit on a number of boards. I've sat on early stage boards, particularly in the healthcare industry. I sit on publicly traded boards, both in the healthcare industry and in the financial services industry. And I sit on a number of not-for-profits, including MATTER and, at one point, Hyde Park Angels. So governance is a subject that is important for all organizations, but at different levels of an organization, there are kind of different responsibilities and different issues that you face as a board member, and I look forward to talking about that more in our discussion this evening.
Hi, I'm Shelley Rosenberg. I'm the oldest person in the room, let alone on this board, and have been on many, over 20 public company boards and probably an equal number of private boards. Some health, but not exclusive to health. I have been involved in governance and compensation for both private and public for many, many years, and have sort of made that, if you will, a specialty. I am passionate about getting women on boards. I have done a number of projects, mostly at Northwestern's Kellogg, but sometimes also at Northwestern Law School, trying to figure out how to get more women on boards now. The numbers are deplorable, both at the public and the private level, and there is no excuse for it, so that we really got to think through how we get women on boards, and the fact that you are all here and interested in that or already doing it is really nice to see.
Thank you. So because half of the room here has never been on a board before and is interested in learning more about it, what we want to do is frame up some context around the different options you have and how different types of boards work. So to start, I'd like to hand it over to Shelley to talk a little bit about the high-level differences and similarities between private boards and public boards. And from there, we'll dive into the differences within private boards.
In many ways, private and public are similar. And what I mean by that is there are corporate governance requirements, whether it's private or public, and those need to be abided by. Yes, there are real differences between private and public, but there are real differences among the private and among the public. A board of a startup is not the same board as one that's getting close to doing an IPO. A public board of a company that has a capital structure of under $2 million is very different than a company that has a capital structure of over $2 billion. So to suggest that you need not look at the differences even within a group is inaccurate. You need to understand it. And from my perspective, the first thing you ought to ask yourself is, why do I want to be on a board? Getting on a board sounds sexy. It sounds like a real neat thing to do until you first decide, why the hell am I in this room? And among the things that are there is there's liability that's attendant to it. And you may find yourself, if there's, God forbid, a company that doesn't have any D&O insurance or doesn't have any liability, you're really on the hook. And if there's a capital issue, you may be right there having some liability. So, and getting off a board once you're on a board is probably much more difficult than getting on a board. So there's a lot of thinking that you ought to do before you join a board. I don't want to scare you into not going on one. There's homework you need to do before you join a board.
So you bring up an interesting point, which is that within public companies, within private companies, boards are different. They differ by company. So maybe what makes sense is to have Nancy, you talk about your experience on Diagnostic Photonics, which is a startup board. And then we can talk with you, Ellen, you've been on so many different boards, and Shelley too, about how some of even your startup experience have been different or the same. So Nancy, I'll hand it to you.
Sure. So all the boards that I serve on, whether I vote or observe, are considered startups. We're an early stage venture fund. The seats that I'm given is because we've invested in those companies. And part of the agreement in the investment is we either get a voting role if we've led it or we want an observer role. Why? Because obviously if you've invested in that, you want to be a part of growing that company. You want to make sure that the governance is done correctly, things are going right. I will say something interesting. We had a pre-call. And these ladies made me think afterwards quite a bit. Because we talked about when you take a board seat because of an investment, when you get into that room, do you behave differently than for the interest of all? And my answer was kind of like, well, of course I behaved the same. I have a fiduciary responsibility. I may be there because I invested, but I have to look out for all shareholders. And then there was kind of like, And it's funny because it made me really think. And I thought about, and it's more on an observer role, but I have been on some boards that I've observed, and the board's not functional, quite frankly. And when the board's not functional, people start behaving in a manner that's self-interest and no longer for the company. And it's interesting to think about when you join a board as an independent, your job in so many ways is, because you are the independent, is to bring it back to and make sure that self-interest is dampened down in what matters for the company. And so one of the boards I do serve on is a company here at MATTER, Diagnostic Photonics. It's a spin out of the University of Illinois. We helped start it. It predated me upon sort of the first investment. But we have done follow-on and have been involved in the company for a long time. And if I think about Diagnostic Photonics as a startup board, it really mirrors what so many startup boards will mirror. The CEO has a seat. The co-founder has a seat. That's pretty common for us. There are 3 investors that each hold seats, 2 from the Series A. That's not always common, to be honest. You would expect 1. But we have 2 voting from Series A, and we have a voting from Series B, plus we have an independent. And so we have a construct of a board that those who invested are there, those who are invested time and sweat equity and the CEO are there, and an independent. And really what we do as we get into that board on an early stage is, one, you're always focused on what does the company need you to do to be supporting, what do you need to make them successful, and how do you help at a high level. One of the things I think that's important if you're not associated with boards, when things are going right, you shouldn't be into the details. You should be supporting the CEO and you should be supporting management. You don't need to get into operations day to day, but you have to be there and you need to make sure strategy and the right pieces are being taken care of at a boardroom. On startup boards, the other thing I'll say is there is an awful lot of time spent on the next fundraising round. What are you going to do? You know, it's interesting because as it gets older and the companies mature, that becomes less of an issue. But I can't think of a board that I'm on or involved in that it has to do with one of our investments that we're not talking about the next fundraising round. The last thing I'll say in terms of really early stage startup boards and activities is what they need really more often than not is strong domain expertise with people who have networks. And so when people think about, oh, I want to be on a board, oh, I really stress pretty strongly, if you're someone who has a domain expertise, you're mentoring a company, you start as an advisor. And as they build up that board and they think about the independent, you become an important key member to them. You're kind of so important to them, they want you in that boardroom. But you also have to bring a Rolodex and contacts. So as you think about positioning yourself, make sure as an independent, if that's what you want to do, you're also developing a robust contact and network base because those small companies really need it.
And the independent plays a very interesting role because you've got the others having a specific interest because they're investors. And it's the independent that sort of guides the policing of all of these various. So it can be one of the most interesting positions and one of the most difficult. But I think it's one of the most interesting.
And Ellen, you have been in so many different capacities in your various roles. But what I'd like to hear from you is, one, building off of Nancy's foundation, how would you say you're steering the direction of a startup board or functioning on a startup board versus a more growth stage company? As a board member, how are you acting?
So I actually want to just follow up, and I'll with Nancy's thing, and then I'll try to address your question. Is I've been that independent on a couple of different boards, and I do want to say that when most of the startup companies come out of the Polsky Center in the University of Chicago that we've seen, it's a while before they have the independent. Usually, it's just the inside management, people on the board, and the investors. And then at some point in time, as the company evolves, they decide they want to add an independent. And that independent is, as I think one of you said, really needs to have strong domain expertise. That's why they want you there. You've got strong contacts in the industry. Hopefully you've had some governance experience before so that you know how to operate on a board. They don't have to, they don't have to kind of train you. I don't want to use the word train, but that you have some idea of what it is like to be on a board. And it can be really challenging when you are the only independent. Because I have been in situations where the management and the investors do not agree, and they turn to me in the room and say, what do you think? And you're kind of like, oh my gosh, they're putting me on the spot. And sometimes you're the tiebreaker. Because it's usually like 2 investors, 2 management people, and you're the 5th person, you're the tiebreaker. So that's a responsibility, and it's something to think about. That's something that I feel comfortable handling. As companies evolve, when they move from that startup stage, where they're basically just management investors, they start adding independent directors and then taking on additional capital and bringing on more investors and maybe more independent directors, they get more structured. And so usually startups will have maybe 4 or 5 people on the board, but as they grow, then you may get to 7 or 8 people, and the structure grows to having not just the board, but then you have committees of the board. And then you have to start thinking, well, I have to have people on my board who can be on an audit committee, that have experience in finance and can sign off on audit reports, or they might start compensation committees as well. And so then they start expanding the functional needs of the board beyond just the the industry expertise, but other things. So when you think about joining a board, thinking about what are the different experiences that you bring to a specific board. Sometimes it may be the specific domain. Sometimes it can just be in a functional area, like being a CFO of a company can be very valuable on a startup board or a growth stage company board.
Now, one thing that you brought up is the importance of governance. And what I'd like to ask is to really tie things back to what Nancy was saying around dysfunction. You can have a functional board, you can have a dysfunctional board. How does governance play in to making that board functional or dysfunctional? And that could be for anyone, but especially you, Ellen. I know you're an expert in governance.
Who said I'm an expert in
I said it. I said it.
We all voted on that.
You all voted on that.
The board met.
So yes, some of the things that in governance, in terms of structure, is when you think about what does governance mean? I mean, governance is really the structure that an organization has to set its objectives and pursue its objectives, and the decisions that are made in the process of doing that. And board members have the oversight to make that happen. Now, what happens in a lot of boards is sometimes they've realized that things aren't going the way they think it should be going. And board members will try to step in and they will try to get more operational. And not realize the role of a board member is to be advising the CEO and helping the CEO. And if in fact they have to step in and do the work of the CEO, then maybe they have the wrong CEO. And that's where things kind of get interesting. I'm sure Nancy can talk a lot about CEO dynamics and changing CEOs. But usually dysfunctional boards are boards in which I think the board members don't quite understand what their role is. And again, if they find that and also that any board that you're on, no matter how great the company is, will go through a crisis situation. I've never been on a board that hasn't had a crisis. And sometimes it's something of your own doing, sometimes it's something in the external environment, like the financial crisis of 2008. And I was on 2 financial service company boards at the time. And, but anyways, when you go through a crisis, are the people in the room that you're going through the crisis with the right people to be in that room? And both at the board level and at the management level. And these have to be, so the other thing about when thinking about joining the board, and I think this is one of the most important things to think about, is who are the people that I'm going to be working with? Because we're the ones that are going to have to solve the problems. And so you have to feel comfortable with the people you're with, that you can talk to them openly, that they respect you, and that you respect them, and you have to feel the same way about your management team. And if you don't, you're going to have a dysfunctional situation.
So one thing I would like to touch on from there, you mentioned, a big part of the board role is to think about the management team and to think about whether that CEO is the right CEO for the business. Can you talk a little bit more, Shelley, Nancy, about what happens in that situation, the role the board plays in determining a CEO transition?
I think we've also seen situations where it's the wrong CEO, and the board needs to be the ones who throw the CEO out. That can be an incredibly contentious meeting because it's not typically unanimous in its position as to how to deal with the CEO. So one of the things you ought to do, and Ellen just said it, I think it's critical, before you join a board, talk to the other members of the board and make sure you have some comfort with them, and talk to management, particularly the CEO and the CFO, and if there's a COO, because you're going to be working with them very closely.
I want to make another comment on that. In a startup organization, getting rid of the CEO is a lot harder because the CEO has a lot of equity in the company. And they may have more equity than the investors. When you're a publicly traded company, where Shelley and I have been several times, and we've had to make changes of CEOs, it's a lot easier, actually.
That's absolutely true.
But it's a lot harder in the private companies, and especially startup companies, because you may not have the votes to get rid of the CEO.
In fact, I wonder if the CEO can't get rid of the people in the boardroom because he or she owns so much of the company.
You usually try and put those investment documents together, so no. But I will say the awkward part of that is often too, if it's a startup board, you've probably recruited that CEO that isn't working out as well. So if they're a founder, maybe not so much, but usually you may have been involved in the recruitment of that CEO and you realize that fit just wasn't what you hoped for. The best way you hope that it will go is that person agrees with you and there's a mutual parting of ways. And when it's a founder, it never goes that way. And part of what you try and, really what you work on is a founder doesn't always make the best long-term CEO. And whenever you make that investment and they own those shares and you know the position you're walking into, it's really about going back to what you both said. You sit down with that founder. You really have to understand, do they think they are the CEO forever? Do they understand that that might be a role that's replaced? This is probably more about making a decision to invest and serve on a board. But if a founder believes they are the forever CEO, that happens rarely. And you want them to have that awareness. And if they don't, it's probably not a good board to be on, and it's probably not a good investment. Because as companies grow, and they will, and they change from a startup to making it to a for-profit, that's typically not going to be the same person. And it does get really contentious if you have to make a tough decision, and it is the board's decision often on a CEO. You have a cap table issue sometimes when they have a little more ownership than you'd expect.
So what I'm hearing is when you join a board, you're accepting a lot of responsibility. It's tough situations. You deal with a crisis. You deal with a CEO replacement. You're putting a lot into advising, but you probably shouldn't be rolling up your sleeves and trying to do the operation. So you have all these responsibilities. What else comes in terms of a commitment when you join a board? So you have all of those things in place, but what are you dedicating in terms of time and yourself on a board? And that's
Forget it's also intellectually stimulating beyond belief and a lot of fun. So it's not, yes, there's a lot of the negatives, but there's a lot of positives too.
I have the joy of watching ideas that we thought would become products and services to make a difference. And when they're going well, we actually get to see it. And you play a pretty strategic role with other board members in helping be a part, and it's really enabling management. So, the funny part of this, when you think about, for those who aren't on boards, when it goes well, it's great. It's actually really very rewarding for me. It's probably one of my favorite things. But I spend less time on that because it's going well. It's the ones that don't go well that you end up spending a whole heck of a lot of time on. But at the end of the day, when you think about what's your time commitment, people will define, oh, well, there's quarterly board meetings, maybe there's monthly. It's not what you're doing in the board meetings. It's everything you're doing outside of it. If you're not spending the majority of your time way outside that board meeting, you're going to that board meeting you should know the financials, you should know all that, you should have all of that, you should have spent all your time outside of the boardroom and help building that company, help creating the relationships. We'll go to meetings with them. We'll create, again, a lot of ours are looking for their next round. We're building their syndicate with them. Often I'm working as hard as the CEO on building that next level and bringing in the finance.
It's not much different in a public in the sense that most of the work gets done outside the board meeting. Board meeting's the most boring part of the entire process.
So you know what you're getting into. You've gotten a frame, positives, negatives. There's a lot of responsibility. There's a lot of time commitment. But at the same time, that responsibility has a real positive side to it because the dreams, the ideas realized, and you're actually part of it. And you have the joy of building a business in collaboration with an entrepreneur, CEO, leadership. So if that balance is still interesting to you, how do you actually get on a board? What do you need to do to be part of a board? And I'll start with Shelley and Ellen, who've done this in an independent capacity, because Nancy has a unique situation as an investor.
I have one word, Nancy. Ellen probably has a much better explanation, but it's called networking.
Well, it's my same word. Stole it from me, Shelley.
That's really, yes, you hire headhunters from time to time, but in so many instances, the headhunters are just covering up the fact that various board members have suggested potential candidates. And the sooner you start building up your network, the better you are. Keep good records. Make sure your contact list has all kinds of information in it. And you never know who tomorrow comes back to you and says, I'm looking for, and lo and behold, you're the right candidate.
Yeah, I thought I'd give you a couple specific examples. Most of the boards I've gone on are through some form of advising or networking, and a couple I was approached by executive recruiters. But in one case, I was working on an industry association board. And on that board, and I worked with, you meet other board members. And this was more of a voluntary type of board situation. And one of the people I was working with on this industry association board was a senior executive at Liberty Mutual. And we worked together, and we went through some crises together, and we really got to know each other. And he was the #2 person at the time at Liberty Mutual. And a few years later, after we were both off the board, he calls me up and says, we're looking for a new board member. With somebody, we'd like somebody who came out of the healthcare industry. Would you be interested? And so, I had never really thought about serving on an insurance company board. And I said, what value would I bring? I don't know that much about property and casualty insurance, but they also do workers' comp, and they do a lot of healthcare. And so as we started talking, and I went out and interviewed with them, and so that didn't come through a recruiter at all, and that's a very large company. But it was strictly through my getting to know this person on a volunteer industry association board. And then another one that I was on, which is a private company board, was I had been just a mentor. It was a female CEO, and I had been mentoring her. I actually helped her get her first round of capital. And as the company started to grow and the investors said, we really need to bring on an independent board member, they approached me because I had kind of introduced the investors to her, and they both knew me. And so again, I had no intention of ever being on this particular board. I was just mentoring her and introducing her, and that's how I got on that board. And that's networking. It's not LinkedIn.
Yes.
It's not just going to events. It's really working with people and having people get to know you.
I'd add 2 things. Particularly for women, the first board is the most difficult board. Once you have some success on the first board, the opportunities are significantly increased. And the other thing I'd make a mention of is that Ellen said, well, what do I know about insurance? And this is a gender-specific comment. Not too many men would say, what do I know about, before they'd say, geez, this could be an interesting opportunity. Don't sell yourself short. The fact that you don't know, it's a learning opportunity. The fact that you're not an expert doesn't mean you couldn't be a good board member. And all of us have brains, and we can learn industries pretty quickly.
Actually, a great handoff to Nancy, because you are looking at companies in a totally different context as an investor. And obviously you're investing in companies where you have expertise, where your fund has an understanding, but you're taking the seat not as the independent with domain expertise, but as the investor seat. So can you talk a little bit about what you bring to your unique boards, and also the element of being an investor member from the standpoint of not all investors take board seats. It doesn't always happen, but you have.
So I'll start with the domain side of sort of varied areas. We invest across 3 main areas of technology that don't really intersect that often. So send me into a pharmaceutical or a med tech board, and I feel like I'm completely at home. That was fine. I do remember showing up to one of the boards where I inherited the seat. I did not make the investment, so that's kind of uncomfortable to begin with, right? I'm replacing someone who had that long-term relationship. It is not my area of expertise, and since this world is small, I can't go into details of what it is. I remember sort of that askance look from everyone around the table of, what the heck is she going to do here? And what is she going to bring? And it kind of wakes you up, too. You're like, well, I'm going to go back and spend a whole lot of time and build. I'm lucky enough to have a really strong network, make some phone calls. And then you realize, OK, I'm going to understand that industry better. But at the end of the day, I do know strategy, and I do know how to build businesses. And this company needs money, and I know how to raise money. And turned out, everything went fine. But what I learned from that, when you inherit a board seat on a company that's been around a long time, that board has not changed in that long of a time, maybe getting stale. That
You bring a
boardroom,
lot to it as a result.
and what happens when it gets stale is you're not moving forward. And they're not real comfortable with an outsider walking in because they might be a little uncomfortable recognizing it. And so I would say that there's areas I'm comfortable, there's areas I certainly haven't been, and you have to get up to speed. But at the end of the day, it's fundamental. What's the strategy? What do we have to do to move this forward? And more often than not for us, it's how much money are we going to need to get there? So it boils down to that. And turns out just about every board, whether I observe on it. And it's interesting, I'll spend 30 seconds on observer roles because I observe on quite a few boards as well. You may not be a part of an official vote, but when it's the right boardroom, observers are just as welcomed and really their input matters as much. Why? Because it's about the network. And everyone's looking around, you know what we need, you're sitting in here. If all you're going to do is observe and not add value, then you're making a crowded boardroom. So you spend I spend quite a bit of time just when I'm observing as well, because at the end of the day, what does the company need? What do you need to do to help them get there? And how do you support the CEO and his management team or her management team?
And let me just add in terms of picking up on that is that a lot of startup companies have advisory boards. They don't have formal governance boards, but they have advisory boards. And that's another way to get involved eventually on the company's board. Is many of the people that end up on a company's board will have been people that have been working on the advisory boards of these startup companies. And I know, for example, at the University of Chicago, we launch 5 to 10 companies every year. And I know those companies are always looking for people to be mentors to them or be on an advisory board for them. And over the years, some of those advisors actually end up going on those companies' boards when they've raised enough capital that they have to have a formal and create a formal board. So that's another way to get on boards.
And it's also, even if it's not on that board, it's good on your bio for other companies.
Exactly. And the other thing too, and just in terms of being whether you're on an advisory board or a regular board, I don't know that we've said this specifically, is those are great networking opportunities. I mean, some of the most amazing people I've met have been on boards of directors that I've been on, or on advisory boards. And so, that's another form of networking that you don't really think about.
So what I want to do is sum up some of the lessons here on boards and on getting onto boards so we can talk a little bit about best practices and get to some of your upvoted questions. So what I'm hearing from you here today is, one, the secret to getting on a board is networking in a variety of ways. It might be networking yourself onto an advisory board. It might be through the boards you're already participating on. It might be through your network overall. But you're trying to do this socially, and you don't necessarily have to be the domain expert. You can bring functional expertise. You can bring what you know. You don't have to be intimidated and say, well, I need to be trained. I need to go through a specific program. Bring your operational expertise, functional expertise, your domain expertise within the board. I'm also hearing something that I think is a good transition into better board practices, which is you need to know what you're getting into, and you need to understand when you're evaluating the opportunity, who are you going to be working with? That's part of the evaluation process. And I want to come back to something Shelley said at the beginning. Joining a board inherently carries risk. You need to know that you're protected. You need to be making sure that D&O insurance is covering you. You need to understand your liability. You need to even understand your privacy, right? Do you want to be in the Wall Street Journal is something that Shelley has said before, right? And if you don't, you want to think about that really carefully. So there are risks that come with it. It's a significant commitment, but there are a lot of rewards as a result. What I'd like to ask each of you is, you've all sat on boards. What is something that people don't often think about, even when they're on boards, that ultimately provides the most value or creates the most opportunity within a company?
I think I'm going to be at the risk of sounding redundant. In my early stage company boards, it's strategy and ability to pivot. I haven't started any of these tiny companies that I've been with, and it's been 4 years now that I haven't seen a pivot, so you have to be flexible on it. But you have to have a strategic mind that you're not just going, you're not letting the CEO do this. It's what's our new strategy, why are we doing it, and where do we have to get to?
Boards can be incredibly challenging, but working together with your fellow board members and with management and meeting those challenges and seeing the company, follow through on the strategy and eventually achieving the results that you set out there is a great, and to me, is a great reward. The opportunity. I mean, there are all these negatives. Is all this risk, can be risk associated with being on boards. But when you achieve the objectives that you set out, it's incredibly rewarding.
I would add to that, and some of the things, all of this is absolutely true, but you can really make some social differences too. Sitting in the boardroom as a woman, you can add pressure to add women both in the C-suite, in the board, below at different levels. You can really make a difference, big or small. I sat on a major company where I was the only woman initially. The company now has 3 women on its board and a number of women in the C-suite. It's just a matter of making sure that this issue is thought through. And in this particular company, they tied it to compensation, and it made a real difference.
Awesome. I do want to get to audience questions, and we have quite a few. So I'm going to be using this, but like I said before, we'll stick around to answer your questions as well. So the first question that I have here is, what % of shares of a startup do you give each board member?
I'll start. Mine's easy. I'm not allowed to take shares. We're an investor. I have had people who interview to work at my firm specifically ask, can I take personal shares? The answer is no. All of our shares are there because of our investment. I've got the easy answer on it.
Mine's totally different. I have never taken a role, startup or anywhere I don't take shares, and I take my fee always in 100% shares. I don't want the dollars, I want the shares that come. And how much you get, that depends on whether it's a small company, a big company. I mean, that varies, but you can get paid in shares.
I think it's ultimately a compensation question. So how are you compensated for your time on the board?
On startup companies, almost always independent board members are compensated through equity. Startup companies don't have cash to pay retainers, so it's almost always equity. On growth stage companies, you might start seeing some growth stage companies start providing a small retainer and or equity. So it can be both or it could be one or the other, but usually it'll lean more towards equity. On publicly traded companies, it's cash and equity. It's about 50-50. And you can elect. Most companies allow you to elect to take your cash and equity. And people do, people do that. You have the option of doing that. But usually it's 50% of your compensation is a retainer and cash, and the other 50% is in equity.
Made the most.
That's how I've seen it work.
Yeah, I've made the most money by taking shares at a startup that then became hugely successful. So you might think of cash sounds nice. I urge you to think about taking shares.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting one, and I think an important one because it ties into the compensation question, but really from a time perspective. So do you have any broad guidelines on how to balance your responsibilities at your core job with board responsibilities, especially when you're working with startups?
That is a really good question.
I'll just say I have one that isn't going well, and my team is always like, are you still working on that? It takes up my entire day, and on the weekends my husband wants to know what I'm working on. And so if it's going well, it's not as much time. But if you have a lot of money invested into an entity that isn't going well, you start finding time outside of time, because if you don't save it, then your fund is in trouble, so you're going to do everything you need to do to save it. When it goes well, it's funny. The ones that go well, I don't spend nearly as much time on. We set the strategy, we set the time. When the CEO needs something, I'm there. But when it isn't, it can, for startups, it can be endless.
That's true for any company,
Right.
Whether it's startup, small, big, and even the biggest public companies. If you've got a problem, you're there a lot of.
And sometimes, as I said earlier, it's something you can control, but oftentimes it could be something you can't control.
Yeah.
And So it's, you don't, it just kind of comes at you, so you're blindsided, like the financial crisis, when all of a sudden, you know, I'm sitting on a bank board and we got to decide within a certain number of time if we're going to take TARP money, and I mean, just all sorts of stuff's happening, and it's like a full-time job, and you just have to figure out how do you make all this happen during your day job. And what happens oftentimes, whether I think it's startup boards or publicly traded boards, you know, everybody has full-time jobs usually who are on the board. So what happens is you start at 7 a.m. in the morning, and you're still talking to them at 9 o'clock at night, and that's how they do it. You do your day job, and then all the rest of the hours you're working on this crisis that you're trying to get through.
You can be blindsided. I mean, in today's world, it's more common, but I've sat on a major board where sexual harassment was the issue, and the question was what to do with the CEO. I think we spent 2 weeks doing around-the-clock calls, and part of it was not all the board was in agreement as to how to handle it. And if it's out of the city, you're traveling some too.
So this ties into the idea of crisis, and it's a question that's the most upvoted question from the audience, and it's about outcome. So it's about how the board could fail to keep outcome from that outcome. And what I would say is maybe even think about it in terms of, you know, how much control do you have as a board member or as a board in times of great crisis?
The answer is one doesn't have anywhere near absolute control. That's why it's important to know your fellow board members so you can build a real consensus among you. One doesn't get anywhere. Consensus can get the job done. That's why you want to know these people beforehand and understand whether you can work well with them.
It's hard to speak. I don't know the specifics of the outcome situation, who was on their board and so forth, so it's hard to speak to that specifically. But I will say that if you don't have a well-functioning board, you know, you're going to end up in situations like that.
The other thing I'll add to that, because I don't know the details either. You know, I read what probably everyone else read. Who knows if it's true or not? But if numbers aren't accurate, and you know, the board's got to have their dashboard. They got to believe in their management team. You know, if growth is accelerated at a certain point, there's certain reality growth. There's certain unicorn growth, and when it's unicorn growth, as a board member, there's some healthy, tough questioning that should happen to understand it. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I don't know anything about it, but when things are going really well, you can easily get caught up in that and celebrate it and think it's the best ever, and it's just hard. And it may just be something hit that we didn't know about. So being in Chicago and startup, that it's kind of really tough to see for outcome. And what I love seeing is it sounds like they're getting back on their feet, and let's all keep our fingers crossed that they grow and do well.
So I'm going to do 2 more questions before we wrap up. This is an interesting question, and I think a very equipped board to answer it since you have had a variety of board roles. Do you recommend focusing on a single stage of evolution as a board member, so startup only, growth stage only? How would you recommend approaching that?
I'll start. I do have some that are a little later, some that claim they're thinking about IPO. Not sure. We'll see what happens. I don't think you should focus on one stage only. For me, I'm in a unique situation that I get a chance to do this for not having sort of the network per se as it would be. And what I'm learning by the various stages I'm a part of is very different and brings a much better prepared board member to each of the boards I go to. So my general thought is no. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't have some focus when you get started. It's not like you can be all over the board. But I would say that start somewhere, but I wouldn't frame myself specific to this is the only stage I work in. Think about what your expertise is that you're bringing to that boardroom and spread it across whatever stage it's at.
I agree. I think you can probably bring value to any board, at any, regardless of where it is in the spectrum. If you feel you can particularly add value in a particular area, you know, you might want to focus there. But I have found that that I have been interested in all the different stages. I've enjoyed my public boards. I've really enjoyed my startup boards. I sometimes find that I'm more valuable in the startup community than I can be on a public board because they have so many more resources than the startup companies. But I enjoy both of them. I enjoy the larger companies, the smaller companies, the mid-sized companies. I think it's just what do you get excited about? I guess that's it. You know, are the people you're working with doing things that you're really excited about? Do you like the industry? Do you like the opportunity for the business? Is the business a growth business? And do you like the people that you'd be working with? And that's how I would focus my search, I guess.
You both said it.
What I'll do is I'll wrap up on this last question because I think it nicely balances the folks in the room who want to think about joining boards and the ones who want to be better on boards. And that's really about this question of how involved in the operations of a company you get and how in the weeds of a company you get. So would you share your perspectives on that?
I think I've said it. A functioning board should not be in the day-to-day operations of a company. It should be at governance and high level. When things start to break down, when things aren't going well, perhaps you have had to make a tough decision on a CEO. You're not in the position to recruit the best CEO. The board sometimes has to, a member will step in and be interim on it. But I feel very strongly, as I've been on boards where board members think their role is operational, it doesn't go well.
Then you get into a situation where there's a restatement, and all of a sudden you're in the weeds. But most of the time you shouldn't be anywhere near those weeds.
I concur with what both of them said.
Well, thanks so much to all of you, Shelley, Ellen, Nancy. We really appreciate your time. Thanks so much to Matter 3.8. Thanks so much to all of you for coming today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Add a closing statement.
Part of the reason I'm sitting here was about, I'm going to say a year and a half ago, Miriam and Holly had come to me to talk a little bit about what they wanted to do with 3.8 and what they were thinking. And I remember being very supportive, but maybe also saying, have you guys really thought about this? Are you sure? You know, I just want to say thank you for what you've pulled together and what you really are doing for the community.
Absolutely.
From two people who have that idea.
Well done.
Great. For all of you who are interested in 3.8, there are computers at the back where you can sign up for more information. And like I said, some of us will hang out to answer your questions. But thank you.